hearing today on air quality and look at the issue of lead pollution, especially lead that comes from aviation fuel. One of the reasons we're having this hearing is to create and keep a record of the testimony of the studies we reviewed so that it can be used for further purposes down the road if we want to look at legislation or other policies to try to help with this problem of lead pollution. We know that research shows that folks who live near general aviation airports have higher levels of lead in their blood. That is a problem because the Centers for Disease Control has come out and said there is no safe level of lead in your blood. We're going to look at alternatives to leaded gasoline and to see how feasible that is. I know that the federal government is looking also at having folks switch to unleaded gasoline in airplanes. It is interesting that this year is a 40th anniversary of the EPA's decision to phase out lead from vehicles. That's caused a dramatic reduction of lead pollution across our country. However, one of the greatest sources of lead pollution right now comes from airplanes. And this hearing will explore that and see what can be done. Because of the format, we'll have experts testify, and we'll have public testimony at the end. And if you can stay towards the end and testify, that'd be great as well. One housekeeping matter, there are keys to your left for the bathrooms. And if you want to go there, you have to go around the building and use it. So we're going to get started here. And let me first call up our first panel, Dr. Philip Fine from the South Coast Air Quality Management District, Dr. John Froines from UCLA, and we're going to hear from Rebecca Anthropoulos, who will be joining us by video.
This is the California State Senate.
And Dr. Fine, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you everyone for coming out today. What I'd like to do is kind of tee things off with a little bit of background. The Senator's office wanted me to talk a little bit about air quality in general in South Coast, so I have a few slides on that, and then kind of talk about what in the South Coast Air Basin, what are our major sources of lead, why do we care, and then some actual studies we've done of lead when we've done monitoring next to airports and see what kind of levels we saw there. So just to kick off, if you're not familiar, Air Quality Management District, we're a regional agency. We cover 4 counties, LA County, San Bernardino County, Riverside, and Orange County. It's a very large area. It's almost 17 million residents. It's the largest local air quality agency in the country, if not the world. And again, we have many challenges. We have millions of vehicles. We have thousands of diesel trucks. We have the 2 combined ports. And one thing to know about our agency is we primarily have authority over regulating stationary sources. These are sources that don't move. Things like cars and trucks are either the federal or state government, but also planes and ships and trains. The authority for regulating those sources are under the federal government, EPA, or in this, when we're talking about aviation fuel, also under FAA. So just to talk about air quality in general, lead is an issue for us, and I'll talk about it, but our 2 main pollutants which we worry about on a day-to-day basis are particulate matter and ozone. So particulate matter, this is a trend for particulate matter 2.5, PM 2.5. These are very small particles, less than 2.5 microns in diameter. They're invisible to the naked eye, but they can go deep into your lungs, and they cause known health effects. So we've been doing pretty well on the PM 2.5 since we started measuring back in 2000 when the regulations were passed. We've really cut those levels about in half, and we're really very close right now to the federal standards, both for the annual standard and the 24-hour standard. So it's a real success story, and hopefully by next year we're going to be meeting the federal standards, the federal standards for PM 2.5. Although EPA has tightened up on that, and there's a new federal standard for PM 2.5. That will have to be met in the 2020 timeframe. So when we talk about ozone, this is even a bigger challenge for us. Again, a lot of good progress since the 70s. The number of days exceeding the standard has come down, the levels have come down, but we have a long way to go to meet the ozone standards. Our first deadline is in the 2022-2023 timeframe. And the challenge is illustrated here. In order to meet ozone standards, we have to reduce nitrogen oxide emissions. Ozone is formed in the air from other gases that are emitted, and the main one is nitrogen oxide. And this is where nitrogen oxides come from. It comes primarily from combustion. And in order to meet that standard, we still need to reduce NOx emissions by about 60 to 80% by 2023. And that's beyond all current regulations as they continue to take effect. So we need new regulations to get these reductions. It's a very large challenge. And most of the sources that are responsible for that, the only ones that the South Coast has any authority over are the ones that are in the boxes there. Everything else is the state or federal government. So, but we're responsible for meeting the standard. Getting into lead, so you're going to hear a lot about the health effects of lead. I won't go into details, but I'll just mention that lead is a cancer-causing agent. There's a carcinogenic risk. It also has non-cancer effects that are both chronic, which is perhaps low concentration exposure but long-term exposure, but also acute effects, which tends to be a higher concentration exposure but over a short period of time. So it has all three of the kind of different types of health effects we look at when it comes to risk assessment. One thing to note that US EPA, lead is what's known as a criteria pollutant under the Clean Air Act. So EPA sets ambient standards. So these are outdoor levels that we measure that are not supposed to go above a certain level, or you're not in non-attainment of that standard. So actually, Los Angeles so US EPA revised these standards in 2008. The old standard was 1.5 micrograms per cubic meter in the air, and they've tightened it up by a factor of 10 to 0.15. So that's the standard we're currently under. The other thing they changed in 2008 is before they didn't require you to monitor next to sources. In general, air quality monitoring was done away from sources to kind of get regional air quality and more representative of a population-wide exposure. In this case, with the knowledge that lead comes from stationary sources and maybe concentrated sources like airports, that they require you to monitor near sources, which we have done some of that. And also when it came to airports, there was a special provision in the final regulation that EPA did that required like some pilot scale monitoring or initial monitoring at 15 airports nationwide named specifically in the federal regulation. None were in the South Coast Basin, but we had already done some monitoring, and we already had a requirement to monitor at Van Nuys Airport, which I'll talk about in a moment. So historically in the South Coast, when we talk about lead exposure and lead emissions, when you go back to the 70s or before, by far the #1 exposure problem was lead in gasoline for motor vehicles. But as you heard, 40 years ago, a decision was made to phase it out, and within 10 to 15 years, that was accomplished. So that source is pretty much down to negligible levels at this point. But there are remaining lead sources, and they fall into two general categories right now. One is, as we're talking about today, the general aviation activities in airports, the leaded avgas. But the other source are industrial stationary sources, which we do have jurisdiction over. And we have various sources, and they emit various amounts of lead. There's two. If you've read the paper, LA Times, over the past couple weeks, there's particularly one that's a problem at the moment, which is Exide Technologies, a lead-acid battery recycler. So we're actively working on that issue to take care of these other stationary sources that have these lead emissions. There's only two of these types of facilities in the basin. And again, we're working on revised regulations to clamp down even a little more on the emissions of lead as well as arsenic and other things from these facilities. Because of Exide Technologies, as I mentioned, under the Clean Air Act, we are now designated non-attainment for lead because of a monitor we placed as required next to Exide Technologies, exceeded that federal limit back in 2011. And basically, we have to show that we will attain that standard by a certain deadline, which is 2014. And through enforcement actions, through a new regulation, we have been able to bring their levels down, and they have not exceeded the federal standard since the beginning of 2012. Getting back to airports, we have done studies, not regulatory monitoring for EPA, but special studies for our own information on lead levels found near airports. These are ambient levels found near Santa Monica Airport. A lot of you have seen these slides before. They're in final reports that are on our website. But essentially what we found is in areas around the airport, you know, maybe to the west of the airport, north of the airport, the lead levels were what we would call essentially background. They were even less than the basin-wide average for lead. And you can see the two different seasons here. One season is in green, the other season is in red when we came back for another few months. But when we get downwind of the tarmac and downwind of the runway near the blast fence is where we saw elevated levels. So we got an 85 and a 77 just near the blast fence. Even in the community, we saw elevated levels of 28 and 22. But as you go further away, at an elementary school there, then we're kind of back down in those background levels. So it's a small area that's affected. It is elevated. It is coming from the airport. But even at these levels that we measured did not exceed federal standards. But again, you'll hear today that there is no safe level of lead in your blood or lead exposure, so perhaps these may be of concern. But again, we have not threatened any exceedances of federal standards due to the airport activity. We also have done, we had a monitor at Van Nuys because it wasn't named as one of the 15 airports by EPA, but its emissions levels of lead overall triggered a threshold that required monitoring. So we had a monitor there for 3 years before we lost our lease, and then it's no longer required because their emission levels no longer trigger. But this shows the data there. The red line is kind of the federal standard, and we have 1 month averages here. This federal standard is actually a three-month average. But you can see we've never gone above the line. In many cases, it was background. We may have went up a little bit towards the end there, but still not threatening the federal standard at all. But there have been a lot of other aircraft studies, some of which you'll hear about today. There's another study that was done at Santa Monica Airport by EPA after we were there, and they were doing some model development. Basically a dispersion model which takes the emissions, predicts where they end up, and predicts what people will be exposed to. They did this project, and they did some monitoring, limited monitoring, just to kind of make sure their model was predicting correctly. Although their monitoring did not exceed the federal standard of 0.15, they did model some exceedances of 0.15 at Santa Monica Airport. And those were very, very close, again, to the blast fence where the general aviation aircraft were taking off. So when you talk about those 15 airports that EPA required monitoring at 15 across the country, there's several in California, there's only 2 nationwide that have shown exceedances of that federal standard. And one is in San Carlos and San Mateo in Northern California, and the other one is in San Diego. Both sites are very, very close to the blast fence, even closer than we were. We're talking feet, not hundreds of meters from the blast fence. So there's some question about the extent of the exposure, but they have seen some exceedances of the federal standard at these airports. What's going to be done about that is still kind of an open question. And then I see you have one of the co-authors of this study speaking on this panel. I won't go into details, but a big study that came out was this North Carolina study you're going to hear about that looked at blood levels of people living near general aviation airports in North Carolina. And again, their findings are that there was an increase. It wasn't huge, but they definitely saw the gradients in blood levels as you moved further away from the airport. Again, there's other federal activities going on in the area of leaded avgas, and this is kind of a little bit of a timeline. This started, the EPA efforts kicked off really in 2006 when there was a kind of a lawsuit by Friends of the Earth that petitioned EPA to make something known as an endangerment finding, which is kind of the first step that EPA makes before they embark on kind of a regulatory program. And they asked EPA to look at and make an endangerment finding for the lead from avgas. And EPA agreed on a path that they were going to evaluate that issue, and they've been doing that since. And part of that, in 2010, they issued what they call an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking. It's not a rule. It's not even a notice of proposed rulemaking. It's a little bit before that. But it basically was looking for comments and describe the technical data they were going to use to make their decision, and ask for any new technical data, and ask for comments on the approaches that they're going to use for their analysis. So if an endangerment finding is eventually determined, then US EPA is required, consulting with FAA, to establish some kind of standards for controlling lead from avgas. As far as South Coast goes, we continue to monitor lead throughout the basin like we do. We have the sites at many stationary sources right next to the facility. We also monitor for lead throughout the basin at 10 more kind of general monitoring locations. We continue, as EPA might change their monitoring regulations, we'll comply and go wherever we're required to go to monitor for lead. And any special studies as needed if we suspect lead emissions from any source, including airports, we would go and do maybe a special short-term study to assess the situation. We want to ensure continued compliance with these federal standards through, I mentioned some rules and regulations that we have on the stationary sources, so we're modifying them now, and as needed, we'll need to modify them to make sure we're in compliance with those federal standards on the stationary sources. And we do support removing lead from avgas, so we don't have a lot of authority over that, but we'll support EPA on any actions towards working towards that and make comments on the rulemaking supporting such a move if feasible and safe, and you'll hear a lot about that today as well. That concludes my presentation. I don't know if you want to have questions later. Or
Thank you, Dr. Fine. Let me just ask you a couple questions now. The map where there's some elevated levels of lead around Santa Monica Airport, what happens to that lead over time? Does it sit on the ground? Does it fly around? Does it disappear? Where does it go?
Those are ambient, those are levels in the air. So a lot of that will deposit out. Where it deposits out depends how close you are. Will deposit on the ground, and it stays there for quite some time. Some of it will wash out over time. Some of it, if it is a non-organic form or non-soluble form, it might stay in the soil for quite some time. There has been some soil testing as part of that EPA study I mentioned, and they didn't find any actionable levels of lead in the soil around the facility, around the airport. They did find some lead on windowsills and things, but when it comes to doing that kind of sampling for lead on soils and in houses and things, there's a lot of other lead sources that are residential, like old paint, pottery glazes, things like that, that it's just very hard to track back exactly where it came from. But eventually, that lead does make its way through the environment through deposition.
And how does it get?
It goes into the crankcase soil. After you've after you drain your oil, it's a lead sludge. It forms in the crankcase oil, and there are oil pickup stations at the airport, and that sludge goes into a container. And I trust that the people that recycle the oil do it responsibly and do something with the lead.
And thank you, sir. If you could keep your comments till the end, that'd be great. Second question, how does it get into your system, other than breathing it in? Is that primarily how it gets in your system?
You do inhale it, but when the EPA sets those federal standards, it's based not only on the inhalation pathway, the inhalation exposure, it is also based on assumptions about if it's in the air, it's going to make it into the soil, it might make it into your backyard garden and your plants, and you might ingest. The ingestion pathway is also considered. So the 0.15 isn't necessarily just considering the inhalation pathway. It's considering if you have that much in the air, you may get some accumulation on the ground, and you may have some ingestion pathways that way. So it does take that into account. Maybe John can address that a little better when he gets into the health effects.
Thank you for your presentation and for.
Can I just say one thing?
Yes.
One of the problems we have is that when you inhale the lead, it's taken up into your bloodstream at a percentage of 37%. When you ingest lead, if you're an adult, not a child, if you're an adult ingesting lead, it's 5 to 7% goes through your gut. So you can get a much more significant dose from inhalation than you can from actually ingestion of lead.
Thank you. Why don't you just continue with your presentation? That'd be great.
Well, I feel fine. I have the deepest respect for, and is a good friend. And what I'm going to do is talk about lead from the standpoint of an academic, as a university professor, because Phil has working with South Coast Air Quality Management District needs to focus on the regulatory side. I'm not going to focus on the regulatory side. I'm going to focus on the health side, and I'll be brief. Is there some way I move? Which one? Okay, this is a slide that may seem strange. If you look at these three men, if you look at the person on the left, we'll call him an ancient person. Then the person in the middle is everybody in this room. And the person on the far right is a person who has encephalopathy, that is a neurologic disease. The point I want to make is that the point I want to make here is this person, who's an ancient person, has 40 micrograms of lead. You can see it's one dot. This person obviously has a significant body burden of lead. Now, I want to emphasize, and without trying to create panic, that this is everybody in this room. That's the lead that's in everybody's body. That's the body burden. This is 3 times that. This is a person who may die from encephalopathy. This is a person who shows no ill health effects. And so the point I'm trying to get at here with this slide is that we talk about blood leads and we talk about, but blood leads are not a real good measure of the burden that our bodies carry. And we need to ask ourselves, what is this doing to our central nervous system? What is this doing to our peripheral nervous system? What is this doing to our kidneys? And so we have a real problem that we need to address the body burden of lead in the environment. And as I say, this is the body burden that everybody in this room carries. Now here are some health effects of lead. And I'm not going to go through and talk in detail. Obviously, death is one. Encephalopathy is a neurologic disorder. Nephropathy is a kidney disorder. You have to have a lot of exposure to lead before you develop kidney loss. There's anemia, there's colic, there's the decreased hemoglobin synthesis. What this means is that with exposure to lead, the ability to carry oxygen in the bloodstream is diminished and can be diminished even at very low levels of blood lead. There is peripheral nerve damage that occurs. There is also other effects that relate to the hemoglobin issue. But then at the very lowest, we talk about developmental toxicity and also decreased IQ, decreased hearing, decreased growth, impaired peripheral nervous system, and there is transplacental transfer of lead. So that lead is extremely toxic, as everybody really knows. Now, I'm not going to go through this, but I'll just run through it quickly. If we look, this is a day to look at avgas, so I don't want to spend time on other lead sources, but gasoline additives, lead solder, lead-based paints, ceramic glazes, drinking water, herbal medicine, aviation gas. We even now know that it's in lipstick and a whole wide range of consumer products. And the point I'm trying to want to make here is this is litigation under Prop 65, where warnings are required for carcinogens, for developmental toxins, and for reproductive toxins. And the point I want to make with this slide is simply to show you that there have been 17,763 lawsuits associated with Prop 65. In other words, the point I want to make here is that lead is absolutely ubiquitous in our society. And I'll come back to that. But that's very important because we talk about Exide battery plant, or secondary smelter, and we talk about other heavy industries, but we have a very wide range of consumer products and other materials in industry that carry lead with them. Now, here's a slide which is extremely important and basically is the point that I want to make. Here's a a curve showing IQ versus blood lead. And you can see without my telling you that there is no threshold for lead effects on the IQ. In other words, this curve goes up to 0, and there's no leveling off to show a threshold. There's no leveling off to show a threshold. In other words, the effects of lead on IQ are profound and are of major consequence. And there is a recent paper by Joel Schwartz at Harvard University who was looking for a threshold for lead effects in relation to IQ levels, and he concluded there was no evidence of a threshold down to a blood lead concentration down to 1 microgram per deciliter. In other words, we talk about standards, but when you get down to actual health effects, there is no safe level for lead. And that a blood lead were to be 0, your body is still filled with lead that's deposited in the bone. Now, this is the Duke University, and Phil said somebody's going to be talking about that, so is somebody talking about it? Okay, so I won't say anything. I'll let somebody who's more familiar with the work. But the point is very simple, that, as Phil said, and I'll just say it, children living within 500 meters of an airport at which planes use avgas have higher blood lead levels than other children. And I should say that this is work that was published in Environmental Health Perspectives. This is an outstanding journal, and so that the quality of this work underwent peer review and must be considered quite solid in its being carried out. So I would say that we'll benefit from hearing from the authors of the study. Now, what I wanted, just to go back to this issue of body burden, the half-life for lead in the bone is approximately 32 years. So what happens is, as we age, we build up a bone lead burden as we age. So we start out with a low body bone lead burden, and it just increases over time. So what you have is you have a lot of lead that becomes deposited and stays in the bone. Now that results in a significant body burden. And because of lead storage in the bone, effects may occur if the blood lead was actually 0. Well, Joel Schwartz has picked, I shouldn't have picked 0. Picking 1 microgram per deciliter is more relevant, perhaps. And one of the points that I think is very important to understand is that lead is mobilized from bone stores during pregnancy. In other words, as women begin to mobilize calcium to make milk, they also mobilize lead because calcium and lead have similar chemical structures. So as a woman mobilizes calcium from her bone stores, she's also going to mobilize lead. So you have basically the potential for developmental effects. And so if there's no safe level for lead exposure in terms of developmental neurotoxic effects, which is what we're quite worried about, how do we protect the fetus becomes a question of major significance. Now I want to show you some data. Everybody talks about blood leads, and you've heard that, and we'll hear more of it, I'm sure. But I want to, because I've been shown such emphasis on bone lead, I want to show you the results of some research that's been developed that illustrates what can happen when you actually measure the bone lead and compare it to other endpoints. So we have here bone lead and odds of hypertension. So you can see the highest quartile for bone lead shows an increased risk of developing hypertension. This is another study where they looked at hypertension in nurses. I should say parenthetically that lead is well recognized as causing hypertension. And one of the things that's important is that there does not appear to be a threshold for lead-based hypertension. So that's an area of significance, whether you're using blood lead as your measure or bone lead as your measure. So this nurse study, again, shows that the highest quartile of bone lead shows an increased risk over the lowest quartile. Bone lead and risk of developing cataracts, again, you see that the highest bone lead increases risk for cataracts. Now, bone lead is associated with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. For those of you that don't know what that term means, that's Lou Gehrig's disease. And you can see there's quite a significant increase in risk associated with high bone lead. This is a major chronic neurologic disease, and one needs to take these results quite seriously. This is birth weight in mothers in Mexico, and as you can see, as the bone lead goes up, the birth weight goes down. So again, this is, and obviously birth weight in children has significant future events that place the fetus and the offspring at increased risk. Here's maternal blood lead as a predictor of IQ. We've already talked about IQ, but you can see the same kinds of results. And here's maternal lead and head circumference, so that many studies that were done by very established investigators shows you that people who have a significant bone lead are at high risk of adverse health effects. Now, I just want to close and just reiterate what I've been saying all along. There's no safe level of exposure to lead, so that we have to ask ourselves, what is the standard that's relevant? Is 0.15 a relevant standard when we would argue that there is no threshold? And then the question becomes, if there's no threshold and there's no safe level, what do we do to prevent the kind of adverse effects that I've shown you? Basically, I would argue that lead needs to be eliminated from consumer products, the environment, and the workplace, and we need to start looking at alternatives analysis and new technology, innovative technology, so we can think of better ways of dealing with lead. And I would argue the way to do it is not through developing new standards, but to develop new technology that can eliminate the use of lead. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Freund. Before I ask you questions, I do want to welcome Assemblymember Steve Bradford, who's here today at the hearing as well. So a couple questions for you. Is it easy to tell how much blood lead you have in you, or bone lead? Can you just go take a test and find out?
Well, the blood lead's trivial. The sensitivity is very high, so one can measure blood lead with relative ease. Bone lead is more difficult. It's a fluorescence, X-ray fluorescence method, and so one actually shines light on one's knee and can measure the lead in the bone. It's not invasive, in other words. It's a spectral technique.
And let's say
Can
you or
I
your
can I just finish
Yes.
though? I want to an area that I am very, very interested in and is worth placing great attention, giving great attention to, is tooth lead. There are now techniques. You know how you have a tree and you have the circles and you can tell how old the tree is? Well, you can do that with teeth now too. There's new techniques for measuring the age of the teeth, and so you can measure lead in the teeth, and that's a very important new strategy that could be adopted. And so it really deserves, because the instrumentation is buyable, one can obtain it, and so that one doesn't necessarily have to do bone leads, one can do tooth leads. And let me just give you an example. There are a lot of people, so there, with the Exide battery plant, people are talking about doing blood leads, and everybody knows that, and it's controversial. Well, a good study would be to go into that community that surrounds the facility or other facilities with lead. I don't want to just point my fingers at Exide. And do and ask people if they save their children's teeth. It's a very major study using tooth lead.
Thank you. And then my last question, let's say you or your child has higher levels of lead in this system. Is there any treatment? Is there anything?
Well, that's a good question. And I wrote the OSHA lead standard way back in 1978. And one of the questions was, should we use chelating agents to get rid of the lead? And the answer to that is yes, one can use chelation to eliminate lead. But one has to.
What is that?
It's a chemical technique where you give a person a certain chemical which binds with the lead, and then the lead goes out through their urine or feces. So that but one has to be very careful about chelation. Pull lead out of your system, you're going to pull all the other metals in your system as well. So you don't want to go at this willy-nilly, because you don't want to reduce the metals that are known. Is a strategy that has to be done very carefully, and I would argue try and avoid doing it if at all possible.
Thank you. Really appreciate your presentation. And then we'll hear from the third member on the panel, and we're doing this by video. So, oh, look at that. There we go. Rebecca, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
Thank you very much
wonderful.
for testifying. You heard from Dr. Fine and Dr. Forains. I don't know if you were able to watch some of that.
Oh, yes, I was. Mhm.
Okay, so if you could make your presentation, that'd be terrific, and then I and Assemblymember Steve Bradford will ask you questions afterwards.
Great, sounds good. Hello, everybody. My name is Rebecca Anthopoulos. The title of my talk is The Effects of Aviation Gasoline on Childhood Blood Lead Levels. This talk stems from a recent article that we published in Environmental Health Perspectives. Could we go back to the previous slide? Thank you. This talk stems from recent work that we published in Environmental Health Perspectives. This work was completed by me, the lead author, Dr. Marilyn Miranda, and our co-author, Douglas Hastings. Next slide. Thank you. As for my background, I am a statistician at the Children's Environmental Health Initiative, which is known as CHI. And CHI is a research, education, and outreach program committed to fostering environments where all people can prosper. CHI is jointly located at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. Next slide. Thanks. So the first question I was asked to address today is, what dangers do lead emissions pose to children living near airports? Our study in environmental health perspectives directly addressed this question. We examined the relationship between childhood blood lead levels lived within 500 meters of an airport had average blood lead levels 4.4% higher than children who lived at a greater distance. Moreover, this association persisted as far out as 1,000 meters. So that is, if a child lived within 1,000 meters of an airport, then his or her blood level could be expected to be elevated compared to children who lived at a greater distance. In our analysis, we accounted for key variables like age of housing, which is meant to proxy deteriorating lead-based paint, demographic factors, in addition to the season in which the blood lead screening occurred. So, with any study, we want to think about how we can interpret the estimated association. So, in this graphic, I tried to have a little depiction of the numbers. So in our study sample, the average blood lead level was 3.88 micrograms per deciliter. And so let's say that this child lived in close proximity to an airport, within 500 meters. He or she then could expect to have a blood lead level 4.4% higher, amounting to a new blood lead level of 4.05 micrograms per deciliter. So what does this 4.4% increase mean? Is it big? There are several factors to keep in mind when looking at these study results. So first, this estimated 4.4% increase is an average over the 6 rural and urban counties in North Carolina that we used in our study. So in rural counties, we obviously would not expect there to be a lot of air traffic. And moreover, in the urban counties in North Carolina, like Mecklenburg County, that's home to the city of Charlotte, we would not expect the level of air traffic that we have in the major U.S. metropolises like New York or Los Angeles. Moreover, this study took place in the context of North Carolina. And North Carolina is a state that's in compliance with national air quality standards. So some might say that we probably shouldn't have even observed this harmful association between residential proximity to airports and childhood blood lead levels. That North Carolina is a relatively safe environment when it comes to air quality. There are other factors that need to be considered. For example, flight paths. As the previous speakers have alluded, we know that lead emissions is greatest during takeoff, landing, and taxiing on runway. Prevailing wind patterns. In other words, where is the emissions being blown relative to residential communities in the vicinity? And another factor that is important to consider is the location of a child's school. So we know that lead exposure has numerous harmful effects. As the previous speaker indicated, there are symptomatic effects like global brain disease, anemia, at high levels of lead exposure. But at low levels of lead exposure, many of the effects are what we call asymptomatic. And by that we mean when we look at a child, we cannot tell that he or she is sick. Such asymptomatic effects generally occur at low levels of lead exposure, and some examples of these are decreased attention span or lowered IQ and academic performance. The scary thing about asymptomatic effects is, let's say you have a child and he or she is performing below, not up to par in his or her class. And this is as indicated by standardized test scores. So when a teacher observes that child, the teacher might think, oh, well, this is just where this child naturally falls along the distribution of test scores. The teacher might not suspect that lead exposure might be a factor in this child's performance. This idea makes lead especially dangerous to children and to society as a whole. Is necessary before adverse effects can be seen in children and in adults. So, as you know, most of the research on the harmful effects of lead exposure focus on children. And the simple reason for that is that children are not little adults. Children are especially sensitive and vulnerable to the effects of lead because of three main factors. First, they have distinctive behaviors. Infants and children frequently engage in hand-to-mouth activity. For example, an infant will be crawling on the floor. Unbeknownst to the parents, the dust on the floor is contaminated with lead, and that infant puts his or her hand in its mouth. Moreover, children often take objects that may be contaminated with lead and put them in their mouths. These sorts of behaviors open up a pathway for lead to enter into the system. In addition, lead is even more dangerous to children than adults because children's bodies are still growing, allowing them to absorb even more lead. Moreover, the developmental status of children's brains and nervous systems make them especially sensitive to the damaging effects of lead. So, with the mounting evidence in research that spoke to the harmful effects of lead exposure, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has incrementally lowered what is known as the blood lead action level over the years. In 1960, the level was 60 micrograms per deciliter. And the blood lead action level, I should clarify, is the level at which children are identified as being exposed to lead and therefore are eligible for special services. So over the years, the CDC has lowered the blood lead action level to its current level that was recently instated in 2012 of 5 micrograms per deciliter. However, as the previous speakers have already mentioned, even this level might not be low enough. There's considerable research that shows harmful effects of lead on neurodevelopmental outcomes at even 2 micrograms per deciliter. And moreover, recent risk assessments have said that it's not possible to identify a blood lead level below which no adverse effects of lead can be observed. The final question that I was asked to address is, how does the contribution from aircraft to lead risk compare to other sources? In addition, how significant would the discontinued use of leaded avgas be? And for both of these questions, it's difficult for me to quantify both the contribution from aircraft to lead risks and also how significant the discontinued use would be, but I will provide some background information. So first, leaded avgas accounts for about 50% of lead emissions in air. And leaded avgas represents the largest source of lead in air. Despite these somewhat impressive statistics, we know that deteriorating lead-based paint remains the primary source of lead exposure in children. In a recent study that assumed a population-based perspective, researchers tried to quantify the contribution of lead exposure to loss of IQ points compared to that contribution by other environmental contaminants and medical conditions. And what the research found was that lead exposure accounted for a cumulative loss of nearly 23 million IQ points. And this loss was exceeded only by that caused by preterm birth. What this reflects is a downward shift in the IQ distribution of young children in the United States. And such a downward shift, if you imagine that distribution, would be sufficient to disqualify a child from a school gifted program because his or her IQ would be lower than what it would have been without lead exposure. And at the lower tail of the IQ distribution, that downward shift would be sufficient to push a child into special education services when otherwise, in the absence of lead exposure, that child would not have needed those services. So, is this reason for action? Despite progress that we have made in the United States in reducing blood lead levels, there's still evidence that the harmful effects of lead are seen on a variety of neurodevelopmental outcomes in addition to other types of outcomes. We've already moved as a society to eliminate lead from automotive gasoline and paint. And so in that logic, it seems only prudent to eliminate leaded avgas as a source of exposure. So here is a slide of just some references that and finally, I want to acknowledge my co-authors, my colleagues at CHI, in addition to our funder, the US EPA, as well as the North Carolina Department of Environment and Natural Resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca, for your testimony and your presentation and for your important study. I have a couple questions.
Sure.
Is there a reason to believe that the study that you co-authored wouldn't be replicated at other general aviation airports?
There's no reason to believe that. I would suspect our findings are, I would suspect that if you were to replicate that study, you would find that our estimated effects are modest compared to what you would find in, real metropolises in the United States.
And the second question I have, how is the lead being sitting there? What is causing that lead to then appear in the air from these airplanes?
What is the mechanism through which the lead enters the system? Is that the question?
Enters the air. Is it airplane exhaust, or what is increasing it around the airports?
The assumption in our study is that it is residential proximity to airports, and by that it would be the air traffic that uses leaded aviation gasoline. However, I guess we can't definitively define that, right? Because our study an airport as we've defined those buffer zones, and if he or she does, then how does his or her blood level compare to children who don't live near the airport?
The reason I ask that is, and I don't know if you can answer it, I'm just wondering if there are mechanisms a little bit similar to how we did with cars. We stuck catalytic converters on them and then reduce pollution that way. Are there ways to simply filter that exhaust so the lead doesn't come out as much?
So I'm not sure I can speak to that. I will say that one thing I've thought about in the aftermath of this study is that, you know, fine, if you live in close proximity to an airport, you may be exposed to greater levels of lead in the air, but the other avenue through which you might be exposed, I think as a previous speaker alluded, is that some of that lead in the air might settle into the soil, right? So in that vein, I think it would be important to, you know, take soil samples, especially where there may be children playing in yards.
Thank you. And Assembly Member Bradford has a question for you.
Okay.
Population that you used in your targeting?
Yeah, those numbers are like out of my head right now. So the size of the population was 125,000 children. These children were aged 7 months to 9 years. And the duration of the study, we had blood lead screens between the years of 1995 and 2003.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Very brief.
Yes, go ahead.
Just one thing to keep in the back of your mind is that there's also an occupational issue. We think about the children, and rightfully so, but there are workers who are filling those gas tanks with leaded gasoline, so you have the potential for skin absorption as well as inhalation. So the worker shouldn't be left out of the equation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentations today on the first panel. I appreciate all the work that you do. We're going to call up the second panel, and if you have time, if you could stay around for other questions. But if you don't, I understand that as well. But thank you very much for being here today. So the first panel is on the health risks of lead. The second one is going to be on leaded versus unleaded aviation fuel. And we have with us Dr. Fokion Egofopoulos from USC, Karen Magliano and Nicole Sotak from the California Air Resources Board, and John Pfeiffer from the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. Whenever you're ready, you can start.
Thank you so much. My name is Fokion Egofopoulos, a hard name to pronounce. I'm a professor at USC. I'm working for the last 28 years on the science of combustion. The analogy is I'm not promoting combustion. I know very well how bad it is, but it's a reality. It's like the oncologist who's trying to cure the cancer. So the reason we're here is because we have a difficult problem. It's not that we're not to solve. So let me, first of all, I don't want to make it too technical. This is very soft material, but when you drive your car, you see the small cars and the large trucks. There are two different types of engines. This is the gasoline engine. That means you mix the gasoline and the air outside, and then you inject it inside, and then you have a spark here. It sparks, and then it creates a wave that burns the fuel, and so you can drive your car. We call this the gasoline engine. It was introduced in 1876. The dates are very important here. So many, many years ago. When you compress here, you compress by a factor of about 10. The maximum pre-combustion pressure is about 8 bar. These are light engines because we don't pressurize too much this engine. They burn light fuels, 5 to 8 carbons. It burns cleanly. Its efficiency is not that high, it's 25 to 30%. I guess this should be 30. and it has a spark, so it starts under any conditions. But the major problem with this engine is knock. Knock means the following. When you inject the gasoline and you fire the spark, instead of igniting there, you can ignite in other places. So you have many waves converging, create pressure waves, and as a result, they build up pressure, and that can be detrimental for the engine, and the engine can be damaged. The other type of engine we have, these are the big trucks, is the so-called diesel engine, introduced in 1893. Here, you compress the air, and then you compress it at very high compression ratio, about 20:1. So we talk about very high pressures. This is all relevant here, 40 to 50 bar. These are very heavy engines. These are light engines. They burn heavy fuels, 12 to 16 carbons. The burning is not clean. The efficiency is high. You see there's pluses and minuses. And the ignition is achieved by compressing it so you don't have a spark like you have a spark plug here. So under cold conditions, maybe the engine will misfire. However, in this engine, the engine knock I described here is not an issue. Why I'm telling you all those things? Let me see. Okay. Both engines have been around for 120, 130 years. The problem is that they are the same engines. They are more beautiful, but the basic principle of operation is the same. The reason is not that we're not smart, is current science and current computational abilities we have cannot allow us to design an engine from first principle, which means we can optimize and make everything perfect. So the way we the way we drive our cars and the way we fly airplanes basically is based on empiricism and experience, not good enough. Fuel plays a critical role, that's why we're here. Again, the way the fuel companies design fuels today is based greatly on empiricism and experience, again, not good enough. You know this material, since this engine knock has been a problem and has been detrimental, we need to reduce the reactivity of the fuel. And in the 1920s, the tetraethyl lead, which we call it lead nowadays, and this is the chemical formula, was introduced as an octane booster. When you buy gasoline, you see the octane ratings. Usually the most expensive gasoline has higher octane ratings. More octane means it does knock and the engine is not damaged. So people were very smart back then and they introduced lead. However, the previous speakers already discussed this in the mid-70s. That was phased out. It was damaging actually the catalytic converters and also the effects on health. So today leaded fuel is a thing of the past unless you are flying a private plane. So what they found, the information, this is all soft material, not scientific material, is about 75% of small aircraft are using those gasoline engines because they are small, they're not too heavy, you cannot afford in a small plane very heavy engine like a diesel engine. That could be an option, of course, if we can make it lighter. It's not very expensive compared to turboprop and other engines that are very, very expensive. And also they need to use light fuels that can survive the high altitude so the fuel doesn't freeze. I mean, that was discussed earlier. I didn't know what the previous speakers will discuss in detail. So again, it's a small portion compared to what used to be emitted by cars, but it affects a great deal of people around the airports. And it has been under the radar, that's what people think, because this is a niche market. Now, the question was asked is why lead is not needed in jet fuels. It's because a jet engine, the one you fly from here to New York, is a very different engine. It does not knock, and lead is not needed there. Now, one can fly a plane with unleaded gasoline. The problem is that you cannot pressurize very much that engine. That means you cannot get too much power out of this. So if you're happy with low performance operation, then unleaded gasoline is real. However, if you're trying to increase pressurize the engine and get more performance and you put unleaded gasoline, the engine will start knocking and will be detrimental, as I said earlier, for the engine. So increasing the pressure in the cylinder of the engine to get more performance out of this favors directly knock. Now, the question is why we managed to do this in passenger cars and not in airplanes yet, in those types of course, small airplanes, is increasing performance is not as critical for a passenger car. Yes, we ought to have more horsepower, etc. But we managed to develop science to create unleaded fuels for passenger cars where basically the compression ratio is around 10, and we can live with that. An aeroplane needs to take off, requires a lot of power there, and there are many unpredictable conditions up there and can fall out of the sky. So that's an issue, and the octane number, the gasoline you buy from the most expensive gasoline you buy from the gas station is not good enough for some of those engines. Here summarize for you what is available in the market. Avgas 100, this is the standard high octane fuel, 100 to 130 octane, something we don't use in our cars, of course. And it contains lead and is dyed green. I took it from a source from Shell. Then there is a Avgas 100 LL low lead version, but still has 0.56 grams per liter of fuel and is dyed blue. That's low lead version. And recently, they have developed the so-called 82 unleaded UL. Again, it's a new grade unleaded, but again, as I said earlier, it cannot be used in high-performance planes. Looking forward, just a few months ago, the FAA issued a request for looking into this by the manufacturers of fuels and trying to find out how can we develop the technology and science that allow us to produce unleaded fuels that can take these compression ratios. My personal opinion, I've been around for a long time, and I understand science, this is not going to happen overnight, and it will not be easy. It's equivalent to cancer. We can say whatever we want. We have some success stories, but to solve the problem of cancer is not easy. It will require extensive research in academia and industry I'm here, I know what I'm talking about. Understanding why an engine makes that noise, it's not that easy. We don't understand very much how it works. There are some ideas of using ethanol. Ethanol contains oxygen. We don't want to put oxygen in an aeroplane gas tank, fuel tank. And also ethanol can absorb water, can be corrosive and other things. So this is not an option. Maybe what we can do is we can think about modifying the fuel composition and potentially invent new additives. And those may be the solutions in the future. Also, the small size of this market does not create a great incentive either. So that's all I had to tell you. That's a soft material, but unfortunately, in my opinion, if anybody promises that they will deliver an unleaded gasoline tomorrow that will operate at octane number 100 to 130, you should be very skeptical. That's my opinion.
Thank you. Why is it that it's lead that prevents the knocking, and why can't something?
When the sparkler fires and the combustion starts, there are some radical species, very active radical species that consume the fuel and consume the oxygen. And lead has the ability to absorb those radicals and suppress the reactivity. So it does not allow combustion to initiate in other parts of the cylinder and create this unfortunate event of having pressure waves colliding and building more pressure.
Thank you. Appreciate your presentation, and we'll hear from next presenters.
Hello, I'm Nicole Sotak from the Air Resources Board's Office of Legislation. And I'll wait till the presentation's up. There it is. This will be a very high-level review of how the Air Resources Board has controlled lead in California. Yeah, let's see on. Okay, as we It is the percentage of lead emissions from various sources. And as you can see at the top, the aircraft presents the largest source at about 85%. And those are emissions tons per year. We have some industrial processes. I believe those would be like boilers, smelters, other fuel combustion sources, and some miscellaneous that are the cars and trucks. California's had a very long history in controlling lead, and historically these motor vehicles were the primary source of lead emissions, but due to regulations, we have virtually eliminated these lead in motor vehicle gas. We do have some isolated sources of lead, and I believe Dr. Fines mentioned Cometco and Exide down in Southern California. That was a battery recycling facility, but these are controlled by the South Coast Air Quality Management District. And those lead emissions at those facilities do continue to decline. So that brings us to the lead content of aviation gas, as has been mentioned. I'll also call it avgas. And this is regulated at the federal level, and ARB does not have any jurisdiction to regulate aviation gas. As we see here in slide 4, the Air Resources Board began phasing out lead in the mid-1970s, and I have a great next slide that's rather dramatic. Then after California began its program, the USA EPA adopted a similar program, began that nationwide. And I really love this slide because it really shows how, if you control lead, the drop in concentrations in the air. And as you can see, I believe it's 1976 when unleaded glass was presented into the market. You see a very precipitous drop in lead in the, is it in the ambient air? Mm-hmm. In the ambient air. And here we are today at extremely low levels, just because due to the regulation of lead in motor vehicle fuels. And I do want to mention that the banning of lead in motor vehicles was in 1992. All of California is in attainment for lead, except Los Angeles County is not in non-attainment, and that's primarily due to some localized sources around those facilities that we've mentioned before. To address this problem, South Coast Air Quality Management District has implemented a comprehensive control program that's specifically aimed at reducing these lead emissions from these facilities. The program has been in place for several years, and we expect attainment by 2015. As I mentioned before, the aviation gas is the largest remaining source of lead emissions. If you remember that first slide, that was at 85%. The responsibility for controlling these, the emissions from this aviation gas is split by two agencies. There's the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the federal agency, and they're responsible for setting the tailpipe emission standards, while the Federal Aviation Administration is responsible for ensuring the compliance with the tailpipe emissions, and that can be through control devices, et cetera. Let's see. To better understand the aviation gas challenge, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has implemented a 12-month pilot program to monitor lead concentrations at 17 general aviation airports nationwide. These airports were selected based on their potential for elevated lead concentrations. We have 5 of these airports in California. There's 2 in San Diego and 3 in the San Francisco Bay Area. And these local districts are monitoring and these facilities with concentrations that are half the level of the federal standards. They'll be continued to monitor in the long term. And that concludes the presentation.
Thank you very much. Do you have any questions at all? Okay, great. Appreciate your presentation. We'll hear from the next presenter.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Assemblymember Bradford. My name is John Pfeiffer. I'm here representing the AOPA. AOPA is a not-for-profit membership organization nationwide of about 400,000 members. We have about 46,000 members here in California. Since 1939, AOPA and development of general aviation airports and as part of our national transportation system. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here on behalf of the pilot community on this very important subject, the transition to a new, cleaner fuel to power piston aircraft. I regret that our expert in this area, Mr. Robert Hackman, was intending to be here today, but he was asked to brief in Congress today. So I'm standing in for him, kind of a last-minute thing, and I'm going to be relying heavily on his notes. AOPA continues to be committed to safely transitioning the general aviation fleet to an unleaded fuel. Along with our industry partners, we have been and will continue to be active in pressing for timely action on the search for safe, affordable alternative to 100 low lead. As part of the Piston Aviation Fuels Initiative, PAFI, everything in aviation has an acronym, PAFI, along with the FAA, other representatives of the general aviation industry and the petroleum industry, PAFI is a collaborative industry-government effort and was formed to identify candidate unleaded aviation gasolines, provide for the generation of qualification and certification data on those candidate replacement fuels, and facilitate fleet-wide certification of the fuels. PAFI is designed consistent with the FAA's 2025 flight goal of identifying a viable unleaded aviation gasoline by 2018. Took an important step in this process as it issued a request for fuel developers to submit candidate unleaded fuel formulations to be evaluated as replacements for 100 low lead. Commercial passenger service and the military is absolutely critical to our nation. General aviation is a key component of our nation's transportation infrastructure and economy. There are 5,261 public use airports that can be directly accessed by general aviation aircraft, more than 10 times the number of airports served by scheduled airlines. And they are often the only available option for fast, reliable, flexible air transportation to small and rural communities across the country. General aviation directly supports jobs and businesses in these communities and provides critical services to remote cities and towns, particularly in time of natural disaster or crisis. GA aircraft are involved in all civilian flight training operations, and without them, there would be no training vehicles for airline pilots. They are used extensively for medical evacuation and medical transport flights, for law enforcement and firefighting operations, wildlife surveying, and agricultural operations. And on a personal note, in the community where I live, just last week, over 200 homes threatened by a wildfire were saved by firefighting aircraft. General aviation contributes to the U.S. economy by creating output, employment, and earnings that would not otherwise occur. Direct impacts, such as the purchase of a new aircraft, multiply as they trigger transactions and create jobs elsewhere in the economy. Sales of materials, electronics, and a wide range of other components required to make and operate an airplane. Direct effects accrue as GA supports other facets of the economy, such as small businesses, rural economies, and tourism. General aviation is important to California, which has 246 public use airports, 216 of which are general aviation airports. And GA operations account for 75% of statewide aircraft operations. A full 10% of the U.S. total fleet of aircraft are registered in California, approximately 35,000. General aviation contributes $3.7 billion in economic output, and general aviation visitor expenditures were $1.2 billion in 2010. Directly and indirectly, California state and local government agencies rely extensively on GA and this extensive network of public use airports. So what's the current status? 3/4 of the U.S. general aviation fleet, 167,000 of the 220,000 aircraft, are piston-powered aircraft certified to fly on leaded fuel. Lead boosts the octane, as we have just heard, of the fuel used in piston-powered aircraft, thus protecting aircraft engines against detonation, which can cause an engine to literally tear itself apart during the operation. Today, 100 low-lead avgas contains 50% less lead than it did in the past, dramatically reducing lead emissions from general aviation. While 100 low-lead avgas is vitally important today, the general aviation community is committed to an unleaded future and has actively engaged in extensive research seeking a feasible unleaded alternative to today's leaded aviation gasoline. However, as we've also heard, the technical challenges of removing lead from aviation gasoline are formidable. Despite extensive efforts, no unleaded replacement has been approved that provides adequate and comparable safety and performance to 100 low lead without negative impact on the environment. But work on this important issue continues and is accelerating with a new initiative to test, identify, and ultimately support fleet-wide approval of a viable, unleaded, high-octane aviation fuel to replace 100 low lead. The FAA, the federal agency with oversight for general aviation, and the EPA, with oversight for environmental concerns including aircraft emissions, have worked with the general aviation industry, manufacturers, fuel producers, suppliers, and consumers to address the transition to an unleaded fuel. It is critical to understand the complexity of this coming transition to a new fuel to ensure that all the issues are managed. The stakeholders have come together in this collaborative industry-government effort I referred to earlier, the Piston Aviation Fuels Initiative. PAFI's goal is to support the identification of a viable unleaded aviation gasoline by 2018. Additional work will be necessary to develop a transition plan that supports the production and distribution of a replacement fuel and safety certification approval of the existing aircraft fleet, including any hardware or performance modifications that might be necessary. The complexity, cost, and timeline for successful transition is unknown at this time, as is primarily dependent on the properties and capabilities of the most viable fuels that successfully emerged from the PAFI program. Key issues for development are not limited to the elimination of lead from fuel. PAFI goes well beyond the aircraft operational aspects in order to understand and address the environmental, toxicological impacts of candidate unleaded fuels to ensure we wind up with a solution that does not create a worse environmental impact than we have now. Additionally, a solution must be found that is economically feasible and allows for production and distribution across the nation. As I said earlier, the entire aviation community is committed to working together to facilitate a timely and successful transition to unleaded avgas. To make this happen, it is imperative that interested parties become aware of and support the FAA and industry's establishment and implementation of the PAFI initiative. Funding for this effort remains uncertain as Congress tries to agree on a budget for the federal government. And I would suggest that if you want to help ensure the development and implementation of a solution as soon as possible, we encourage the Committee on Air Quality to work with the members of the California State Legislature and the California Congressional Delegation to ensure the FAA has the funding needed. The current fiscal year 2014 FAA budget as proposed includes $5.6 million in funding for independent unleaded avgas assessment and testing. Thanks again for your time today and for inviting us.
Great. Just one quick question. So my understanding is there's two kinds of avgas. There's a lower lead kind of avgas. Is that what most general aviation planes are flying, or is it a mix?
Primarily, it's the 100 low lead. That's what's being primarily used. There are some really lower performance aircraft in the fleet that actually run currently on avgas. There's not very many, but they're there. But the biggest use right now is the 100 low lead.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for your presentations. Really appreciate it. And we're going to call our next panel up. We have Sean Magadichian, Airport Facilities Manager from Torrance Airport, and Susan Klein, Assistant Director of Public Works from the City of Santa Monica. And before they begin, I just want to put in a record a letter from the Federal Aviation Administration. They have very graciously written a lengthy letter about the initiatives that they are taking with regards to avgas. And I will simply list their 4 initiatives that they've done. First, generally, they're working with the US EPA to go to an unleaded environment. And their 4 initiatives include sponsoring an aviation rulemaking committee, which includes the Environmental Protection Agency and industry stakeholders, to develop a process, cost estimate, and timeline to replace existing leaded aviation fuels with an unleaded alternative. Their second initiative is they have come out and stated that a replacement fuel for leaded aviation gasoline is available by 2018. That's what they're trying to target. Third, their own Modernization Act establishes an unleaded gasoline research and development program. And finally, the FAA notes that they are now involving private sector companies to apply for supplemental type certificates for specific piston engine and airframe models to operate with new unleaded aviation gasoline formulations. So with that, if you all could begin, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Assemblyman Bradford. Sean Magadichian with the City of Torrance. I'm the Airport Facilities and Operations Manager at Torrance Airport. And I'll just give you a brief background on Torrance Airport. We are a general aviation airport. We house approximately 500 aircraft at our airport, and we hit approximately 120,000 to 130,000 operations each year. The aircraft on our field primarily all use with the 100 low lead avgas. We don't sell or store any jet fuel on the airport, and we maybe have a handful of aircraft that use the jet fuel, but they can't fuel up at our airport. All of the aircraft, we house both fixed wing and rotary, meaning helicopters, and we are home to Robinson Helicopter, which is one of the world's largest helicopter manufacturers. And they have several models of helicopters. They have both piston-driven helicopters and jet fuel or jet turbine helicopters. So at our airport, we have 2 fuel dispensaries. They're both run by private entities on our airfield. The city basically just makes sure that they conform to regulations of fuel storage and things like that. Both of the fuel dispensaries both serve the 100 low lead. If there's an alternative fuel that is going to be mandated or approved, the city would be 100% committed to make sure that all of the the fuel providers and operators on our airfield are in compliance and make sure that they are basically changing over to the alternative fuel. I don't have too much on the sense. Like I said, we are a general aviation airport, and I'm available for any questions should you have any.
Ms. Klein?
Great, thank you very much. On behalf of the City of Santa Monica, thank you for the opportunity to address the committee and the community today. Issues related to health and safety of our operations at Santa Monica Airport are of the highest importance. We are encouraged to see the progress being made with regard to the development of alternatives to avgas used by general aviation aircraft. We are also obviously a general aviation airport. We have a little over 100,000 operations annually, and we also have 2 FBOs that are fuel dispensers on the airport, and they are providers of 100 low lead as well. So as you may know, the development and certification of such an alternative to 100 low lead or avgas is outside of our jurisdiction as a municipal operator. However, SMO will continue as a willing and eager partner with state and federal agencies to support the progressive efforts being made towards alternatives. Our recent efforts supporting the development of avgas alternatives have emerged out of the city's 3-phased public process that concluded earlier this year regarding the future of the 227-acre Santa Monica Airport campus. In addition to continuing our efforts with an intergovernmental team to support the elimination of low lead fuel, the city co-sponsored an educational seminar about the future of avgas on June 30th of last year with the Museum of Flying at the Santa Monica Airport. At this free seminar, guest speaker Lars Helmberg, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, he is the founder and CEO of Helmco Oil. He spoke as a developer of unleaded avgas. Established in 1979, this Swedish company has developed a fuel that has been widely used throughout Sweden for decades, including the Swedish Air Force, and is the preferred fuel for general aviation there in Sweden. There's more information on the seminar and the company and the fuel on Santa Monica SMO's website. The City of Santa Monica will continue our cooperative efforts working towards 100 low-lead alternatives and providing more educational opportunities to our community, and we look forward as partners going forward in this effort.
I don't know if either one of you can answer. Is the 100 manufactured or refined here in California, or is it imported? Does the airport?
I do not know.
Okay. Is anyone, you can answer that? Oh, okay. Well, all right then. So are we going to go to our final panel, panel 4 then? Okay, great. We have John Rosenberg, and Martin Rubin. If you're here, we'll change out the panels right now. And thank you for your presentations. Mr. Rosenberg, if you want to start.
I would yield the first presentation to Martin if he likes.
Okay.
That's okay.
Don't fight over it.
I want to follow just in case I need to comment on what you, so go ahead.
I didn't recognize it was a debate. I don't have any formal prepared remarks. I suppose I'm not an official representative of the pilot community, but I am a private pilot. And I do fly out of Santa Monica Airport. So I can speak anecdotally to the community that I'm exposed to and the friends and family that I'm able to conduct conversations with about their experience living around an airport. From a pilot's point of view, we are parents, children, and relatives, just like everybody else who's in the community. We share the same concerns. So there is nothing short of a intense effort to find a way to be the least impactful as possible on the environment and the community. At Santa Monica, there are self-imposed restrictions on how operations are conducted in the flight pattern, and these are in direct deference to the community to ensure that noise pollution and fuel pollution is minimized. In terms of compliance, there's not only a heavy regulatory arm that ensures compliance, but every pilot that I'm exposed to is in favor of whatever is possible that can be done safely and legally to ensure the least amount of impact on the environment and the community. So I suppose I'll yield to Martin to give his remarks, but that's our perspective from a pilot community.
Okay. So I'm Martin Rubin, Director of Concerned Residents Against Airport Pollution. And first I want to thank Senator Lieu for his continued efforts to address the important impacts that he's aware of stemming from where we started, Santa Monica Airport, but certainly it goes, it's a worldwide issue. Back in November 2011, Senator Lieu held an air quality Senate select hearing. I took a couple of slides. A lot of this has been covered, so I'm going to go through it, but it doesn't hurt to reaffirm that over half of the lead emitted from all sources into the air was from aviation. The modeling done for the new standard and due to the Earth Justice lawsuit was not over a 3-month period and not relevant to compare with modeled averages. I'm not really sure about this, but I just have a feeling that a closer look could have been taken around Santa Monica Airport and some issues as to how the flights, the patterns of the flights and number of flights may have been unique and just didn't show up in their work. But again, I don't know for sure. There have been 2 recent articles this month. Natural Resources Defense Council's On Earth publication, Something in the Air, the health risks of leaded gasoline are the thing of the past, right, wrong? Well, we've certainly heard a lot about that. This is a photo that was part of the article. One might think it's an exaggeration, but a couple times this year when a pilot that was out of Santa Monica Airport passed away, they would hold what's called a condor flights, where 4 planes fly in unison, and then they fly around, then one of them falls out. And the noise that even one of a piston aircraft can make, not all of them, but very often the noise in of itself is, so anyhow, this drew my attention. 4 planes, I went out the second time, took a photo of the pattern flight, and you could see this was the second time around with this aircraft here would be the one to fall back and all. community, I just can't imagine how someone would see that and not suspect that there's an accident waiting to happen. It just is noisy, frightful. I would think there'd be a better way to honor a fallen pilot considering the nature of the residential communities that surround Santa Monica Airport. And by the way, all those flights do have lead in them, and so that would be additional lead to be added on. Well, getting to, is it Senator Bradford? Assemblyman Bradford, sorry, thank you. That's okay. Yeah, I know, probably in the future. His question, I'll be getting to that shortly. While jets, and this all paraphrased from this article, that I'm paraphrasing. While jets and turboprops run on kerosene-based fuels, majority of general aviation aircraft are piston-powered and consume aviation gasoline or avgas, which is produced in several grades. Most common is 100 octane lead or 100 LL. We've heard this, and it's good to just, he puts it very succinctly. That's used by 167,000 aircraft, about 75% of the nation's general aviation fleet. People in the industry use the terms 100 LL and avgas interchangeably. No other country in the world has a fleet that still relies predominantly on leaded gasoline. Now, this is news to me, and I know we had the USC professor mention difficulties of getting off of leaded aviation fuel because of the way engines are constructed. Very curious is what they're doing elsewhere. The lead added to avgas is a clear liquid known technically as tetraethyl lead. Only one company in the world makes it, Innospec, a Colorado-based chemical corporation which produces it at a plant near Liverpool, England. Piston engine planes consume about 248 million gallons of avgas a year, spewing out 551 tons of lead. Despite having published dozens of studies on lead's toxicity, including a 2000 report warning that there are currently no demonstrated safe concentration of lead in blood and adverse health effects can occur at lower concentrations, the EPA has commenced yet another study, which it expects to complete in May 2014. The author goes on to say, but if computers can already determine lead pollution at any airport, why does the EPA need another investigation to conclude that avgas is endangering public health? Scientific American overlooked thousands of Americans exposed to their dangerous levels of lead in their jobs. So as Dr. Freund's pointed out, jobs also are part of the equation. The more scientists learn about the dangers of lead, this is all paraphrased now from Scientific American article. However, the more they realize that they may have underestimated how even small amounts of the element poison adults. Research to date has associated small amounts of lead stored in bones, around 10 or 20 micrograms per gram of tissue, some of which may leak into the blood over time, with a dulling of mental acuity in the elderly, equivalent to cognitive decline in 3 to 5 years of aging, notes Mark Weisskopf, a Harvard University epidemiologist. Now, getting back to Santa Monica, since it's where the EPA has done its modeling and where a lot of research, the AQMD also has, and other studies. There are notably 6 elementary schools, 3 middle schools, 2 college campuses, 1 science academy, several preschools that are potentially in harm's way, according to the work done in North Carolina that Rebecca alluded to, was reporting on earlier. The other day, I noticed as a group of bike riders went around Santa Monica Airport to discuss the environmental impacts. I was taking photographs of it. I don't have a bike, but it's here's an infant and toddler center that is located 1/3 kilometer from SMO, and it's well within the kilometer that the North Carolina study was referencing as elevated children's blood lead levels. A little more interesting geography of Santa Monica Airport. The west side of the runway, which is actually the Santa Monica side, and the east side, which is in Los Angeles, where that yellow line is. Aircraft take off at the those white lines. They have to use the whole runway. There is no runway safety areas or buffer, so you basically have planes taking off very close, within 300 feet at either end of the runway. Now, pattern flights. There are 6 flight schools at Santa Monica Airport, and approximately half of all the operations are pattern flights. Training school, piston planes repeatedly expose residents to toxic lead from aviation gasoline. This is the pattern flight from Santa Monica Airport route. This is a sample radar tracks of VFR, visual flight rule arrivals, which are basically your piston aircraft. And you can see the dense pattern flight there. The departures have a similar looking radar track. This is another interesting aspect that I learned about through the information offered online about the flight tracks. There's occasionally, I'm not sure of the number, but it goes on regularly, performing mechanical checks. Like if an engine's rebuilt and they have to break it in, it has to fly for a certain length of time. And you can see this is one plane flying circle, 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 many times around the airport. And that's all has to do also with the potential of the lead. So the North Carolina study, I would have liked to have known if there were any specific airports in North Carolina that showed higher than that really stuck out as higher blood lead levels than any others, because she was certainly saying you expect more in metropolises like LA, and so I'm curious what she might think would show up with this type of flying going on. Now, this is to answer everybody that's come up on this. All your AQMD, your pilots, your cities, your federal government, the precautionary principle, the definition from New World Encyclopedia. And as Dr. Freund said when he came to something, he said, this is very important. Well, I'd say this is very important. The precautionary principle is the concept that establishes it is better to avoid or mitigate an action or policy that has the plausible potential based on scientific analysis to result in major or irreversible negative consequences to the environment or public, even if the consequences of that activity are not conclusively known, with the burden of proof that it is not harmful falling on those proposing the action. It is a major principle of international environmental law and is extended to other areas and jurisdictions as well. This principle is important in that it allows one to anticipate harm and take appropriate precautions even in the absence of scientific consensus that the action or policy is harmful and what might be the level of the harm. As a result, policymakers are able to make discretionary decisions to delay such an action until scientific findings emerge that provide sound evidence that no harm will result. Now, that definition usually is to new things that are going to happen when used. But I think when you have something like we're discussing now, there are ways to mitigate what's going on. It can be mitigated as far as how general aviation needs to go all over the place. Well, you know, there was a time before airplanes, people had to go to all these places and they got there too. You know, there are other ways to get around. And yeah, it's more convenient, but we're looking at something now that needs to change, and I think that, you know, other than those things that there is no, you know, that have to be done, firefighting, this, that, or the other thing. I'm also curious about crop dusters in California. Do they use lead? Are we getting crop dusted and get out the insects and also getting a dose of lead at the same time? So the state of California in 1986 passed the Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act. It's known as Prop 65. And of course, lead made the list in 1987 for developmental effects, both female and male, and in 1992, lead and lead compounds as being carcinogenic. This is a Prop 65 warning from San Diego Airport's jet bridge that warns about the exhaust from jet fumes and all. It's not that clear, but it's pursuant to Prop 65. And the other day when I took the picture of the toddler center, when I went up to the observation deck waiting for the bikes to come up there and give the lecture about the other aspects of the airport, this is not infrequent at all to see families and children looking at the airport. You know, it's visually pretty nice, but you can smell the gasoline from the piston aircraft. You certainly can smell it from the jet aircraft. And the piston aircraft have that smell like I recall growing up from the old clunker cars or muscle cars or whatever, you get that type of smell. So you have them hanging out there, and shouldn't families know that shouldn't they be alerted with a Prop 65 warning to the toxicity they're exposing themselves and their children to? I would say that would be a precaution the city of Santa Monica could choose to take. And that's my presentation. I want to thank everybody and thank Ted Lieu again for having this important, great hearing, and all the presenters too. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you, John and Marty, for your presentations. I appreciate it. And we will take public comment now. If you just, why don't you go to the center aisle, we'll have a microphone there, and then you can ask your question. And try not to be repetitive. That would be great. If you could state your name for the record. What else?
Thank you very, very much.
Name and a city of residence for the record, that would be great.
Thank you very much. Name Jerry Rubin, Santa Monica. Thank you, Senator Liu, and to all the panelists. I know this is a challenge. I know planes have to get people places. But it seems to me, I always felt, and I think everybody knows, that it's the location of Santa Monica Airport that really makes it problematic and different than some other airports. And I think that since the problem is so long in the future for any potential solving for lead-free gasoline, that it's not unfair to ask that the Santa Monica Airport be closed. There's too many, yeah, I mean, it's not something you have to even applaud about. It's something that's the right thing to do. I know that pilots could get jobs elsewhere. I would think the federal government would start planning their airports away from residents and shuttling people to different areas as they seek solutions for future transportation modes 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road. They shouldn't be close, so close to residents and children that are affecting people. The pollution is the worst. The noise is horrible. The safety threats are horrible. I mean, where I live, one of the small planes crashed right near 4th and Pico, and the pilot was killed. The day after Thanksgiving, I remember, and it happens all the time. So all I wanted to say is that I hope the city of Santa Monica would reopen their vision process to include how the city could benefit economically, recreationally, educationally, and environmentally in every possible way, and economically, if there was other things on that land, including open space, including educational facilities from the college perhaps, roads that would diminish the traffic, community gardens, more art facilities, because I just have a feeling that if you analyze the health effects that this is causing, that has never been done, those studies. There are harmful effects to having this pollution ongoing, asthma, whatever. Every teacher and every legislature and every elected official in Santa Monica should be concerned about this and should not just say that is off the table to close the airport. They should be working on it, and they've taken stands legally before, and you can't always predict the legal outcome, but you need to go in there and fight full force. And every legislator, whether it be you, and I know you've been very responsible, Senator Liu, or Congressman Waxman, should really take this up. And I commend the groups that are working, the people that did the bike ride the other day, and everyone that's working together, every neighborhood organization and concerned residents against airport pollution for what they're doing. And just one other last thing. The pilots say they want to be collegial. But my gosh, people were almost arrested at a candidates forum when they were just trying to get in to hear what everyone's point of view was. Now this was open, and all the other organizations are open, and the pilots can attend their forums. And I wish the pilots would do that next year when the election happens and not just shut it off from the public with threat of arrest for anyone other than pilots that are attending. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next person, please.
I'm Laura Szilagyi. I'm co-chair of the Venice Neighborhood Council Santa Monica Airport Committee. And I have a question. I have actually two quick questions. One is, I just want to state that our neighborhood council is for closing the airport. As far as the impacts of lead go, we know that there are pattern flying, which is basically over Venice and Mar Vista and West LA by the prop planes. And I wonder if there's been any research into the effect of lead on the schools outside of that area that was discussed, because these planes are going around and around over schools that are, let's say, a couple miles away or 5 miles away, but they're circling over and over and over again, and whether there's some kind of cumulative effect of lead coming from those airplanes in their exhausts. And secondly, somebody from Santa Monica mentioned how Sweden now has no lead in their prop plane fuel. And I'm just wondering if why that is that we don't have the same kind of fuel as they're using in Sweden, or possibly it's a matter that they have newer, different engines. So, but anyhow, my question, those are two questions, but basically the one about lead, I'm curious. I don't know if Dr. Freunds has the answer to that.
We'll ask the AQMD whether they've looked
I don't
at,
know if they've looked at
that those areas, and then we'll look at the Sweden example that you raised. Thank you. Next person, please.
Senator Liu, thank you very much for holding this hearing, and thank you for holding it here right around the corner from Loyola Marymount University. I'm Michael Brodsky. I'm a professor at Loyola Marymount University. I'm also a resident in Santa Monica, the western end of Santa Monica Airport. We've been hearing a lot about lead the last couple of days. Front page on the LA Times, Exide Corporation in Vernon. Absolutely horrific story. But please look at the map. Look at the area around the Exide plant. It's entirely industrial for miles and miles. And the residents of Vernon are miles away from that plant. Yet now every one of them are going to be tested because of the dangers from lead and the dangers that it poses to all the residents there. In Santa Monica, they are not miles and miles away. In fact, they're less than 50 feet away from the edge of the airport on the south and the north side, and 200 feet from the north and the east side, a lot closer than the residents are at Vernon. In fact, with the playground, and you'll see a piston-leaded base plane that's less than 10 feet away. That plane will start its engines 10 feet within that plane. The lead is being poisoned and spread upon the kids in the playground, 10 feet away, the distance from you to me. So it's a pretty stunning occurrence at Santa Monica Airport. 2 weeks ago, I had Tamara Rubin, who's the head of the Lead Safe Foundation, come to my house. She brought a $45,000 piece of DVR equipment, tested my soil 20 feet away from my house so it would not be impinged by the lead in the old paint. And what she found, that it was 50 parts per million on my soil, and I'm on the western edge of the airport. Now, the last studies that have taken place over 5 and 6 years ago. 6 years ago for the AQMD and 5 years ago for the EPA. Why has the area not been tested in the last 5 years? My house was tested 50 parts per million, which is the same as the red zone you saw right there, on the west side of the airport. I can only imagine how much more impacted the east side of the airport is today. So let me just look at a few facts about the lead and how much lead. There are 100,000 flight operations coming out of Santa Monica Airport every year that are piston-based, that use lead fuel, 2 grams per gallon for each of those operations. Now imagine they burn just 1 gallon of lead for those 100,000 operations. We know they do a lot more. We know that they burn about 10 gallons per hour, and those planes that are moving around, you just saw the pictures on the screen, they can burn 10 gallons an hour. That would be 20 grams of lead. But let's just say one gallon per each of those 100,000 operations. That comes out to a 1/4 ton of lead within 200 feet of residents every single year.
That test was it relatively quick?
It was a relatively quick test. Obviously, it's not a scientific test. It was a informal test. She used the DVR equipment. It would cost about $45,000. She'd be glad to come back here and do that.
Something her organization has?
Yes.
All right, can you give that information to my staff?
I absolutely will.
Thank you.
The last point I just want to make, just to kind of visualize the kind of danger that we're looking at, is 1 gallon of lead is about 2 grams, And so, you know, being that a penny is about 2.5 grams, we can kind of visualize what 1 day's worth of lead would be, something like, kind of like that. So that would be 1 day, and this would be another day. And so I'm going to give you just a week's worth of lead right here. And you get the idea of the seriousness of what we're looking at. So it's something that we need to solve not 5 or 10 years from now, but immediately. And in Santa Monica Airport, it's kind of the wrong place, wrong time. In 2015, when the contract with the FAA runs out, time to let it go. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next person, please. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, how you doing, Senator? Thank you very much for having this. I'm going to try to stay on the leaded point. I'm going to
name
oh,
and city.
Kelly Willis. I'm on Shell Avenue in Venice, right here. I have the airport on speed dial to complain about the noise, but I'm going to stick on the point of lead. While I was sitting back there, I got an email from the CLCV. Please urge Jerry Brown to sign Bill 711 to get lead out of shot that the hunters are using and everything out there and sporting. So there's one thing. Another source of environmental lead. I spent 2 years on probation, forced by my father to work for. I've had to put together more than a few engines, more than a few transmissions, none of them going into airplanes. Professor Egolfopoulos' explanation of the differences in compression and why the detonation goes off and what the problems are with that. So while I was listening to the rest of this, I went back and did a little reading. You can do that with this online thing. And apparently the piston engines that are being used in the Lycoming helicopters right now are all running at a lower compression rating than, for instance, the current Corvette engine is. And the current Corvette engine kicks ass and uses unleaded. So one, I'm not seeing the problem there with getting unleaded up if these are running at 10 to 1 and the Corvette's running at 11.5 to 1. Those of you who don't know what this is just going in there for the record. The reason why I don't do mechanics anymore, one, I got tired of smelling like that, but two, the improvement in manufacturing technologies and material sciences, as well as the incorporation of computerization into the way your engine runs in your car these days, is why cylinder for cylinder, your 4-cylinder puts out more than your dad's 8-cylinder did way back in the 50s and 60s. And as far as I can tell, the reason why they're still leaning on the crutch of leaded gasoline is because they have not been forced to use and incorporate those technologies, which are all tried and true. How many people here drove a leaded gasoline car to work today? Yeah, that's what I thought. None. That technology is tried and true. It was forced onto us by the 1986 unleading of gasoline. If the aviation industry had seen the writing on the wall in 1986, we wouldn't be having this hearing today because they'd have applied the same technologies and the same improvements to their engines that have been applied to the cars. Another thing, a couple other things I wanted to say. I attended your last hearing on similar issue, the business of the pollution from aviation up at Santa Monica, and one of the things that was discussed there was the fact that ultra-fine particles were unregulated at that point and seemed to have the highest latency once it got into the lungs of any of the other kinds of particles, that the body couldn't expel those. I'm wondering if that might not be a lever here in looking at this, because nobody's talked about the size of the particles of lead that are being ingested. And last, as a parting shot, we all know that many people have gone to the Sloan Kettering Hospital, Cancer Hospital back east, to get cured of their cancers. I think everybody should read an article in The Nation from 2000 called The Secret History of Lead and find out that Mr. Sloan and Mr. Kettering are why they use tetraethyl lead, and that's how they made their fortunes, putting that into their engines rather than making good engines. Thanks.
Thank you. Next person, please.
Yes, I'm Walter Davey. I have been a pilot at Santa Monica Airport for 40 years now. And I'm very happy to say that
for 20 of those years, I flew entirely unleaded on automotive gas. And that all came crashing down because of the environmental agencies forcing aviators to use leaded gas. And I really resent this, and the villain in this scenario is not lead, it's alcohol. After the environmental agency and the state of California mandated alcohol and gas, airplanes could no longer use any sort of gasoline made in California except leaded gas. Senator Louie, do you remember last year your assistant, Andrew Chan, handing you a lot of material that I sent you about unleaded gasoline?
Yes.
Thank you. Did you try and take any legislative or regulatory efforts to get lead out of some of the gasoline made in the state of California?
Yes, we looked into it. It's one reason we're doing this hearing. Also, we're largely preempted at the state level from changing avgas, but doesn't mean we can't provide evidence and push the issue. I do have a question for you. What plane did you fly that you used unleaded
Cessna
gas?
182. The compression ratio is 7-to-1.
Okay. And then at some point when California switched and required ethanol, you couldn't do that anymore.
The FAA strictly mandates that no alcohol can be used in any sort of aviation gas. That's a mandate.
If there were a law that said, for purposes of aviation gas in California, if we didn't have the ethanol in there, would you be able to fly your plane again on unleaded gas in
Certainly I would. What ought to happen is that certain gas stations should be allowed to have unleaded, no alcohol gasoline for sale. Every bit of what we burn in our cars in this state is not gasoline, it's gasohol. Right. If we could get rid of the alcohol, the refining process already gives us a 91 octane. The base material for the aviation gas is 93 octane. We're almost there. About 70% of the aircraft, piston aircraft in California, could go and use that fuel tomorrow, and you'd get rid of about 50% of the lead used in this state. So what's happening is about half of the gas used in this state is a direct result of the EPA and the California State Legislature, and I resent it. I would like to get some unleaded, no alcohol gasoline made available at airports.
In other states, could you fly your plane on unleaded gas?
I did for 20 years.
And
it was wonderful. There was no lead sludge, which I mentioned.
Okay.
In the gasoline, I did not get spark plug fouling, which is the danger of lead, and it was great. A couple of years ago, made a flight from here to Denver, and I landed at a small airport in Utah, which is one of the states which is forward-looking enough, maybe it's because farmers don't like it, which is one of the states that actually sells no alcohol gas. I refueled there, and I went all the way to Denver and back
on unleaded gas.
Unleaded gasoline, and when I got back to California, I had to buy leaded gasoline.
Okay.
And it would be very easy to sell 93 octane or 91 octane gasoline at gas stations and at airports throughout California. Can you please make an effort to make that happen?
We are looking into it. If you could talk to Jennifer on my staff and give her your contact information, that'd be great.
Okay. Let's see. I think I've made my point, and that is there are about 4. There's one which has already been mentioned in Norway that's making 100% unleaded gas. There's one right now in Indiana, and there's one in Phoenix, Arizona, and they have 100 octane low leaded gas ready to sell, but they have to jump through an enormous number of regulatory hoops to get that to market. And I would hope that you would also make some endeavors in that area. Thank you.
Thank you. Next person, please.
Good afternoon, Senator Liu. My name is William Roberts. I'm a resident of Westchester, Vice President of the Westchester Democratic Club.
Yeah. Go ahead.
My question to you is, if the federal government, the EPA and the FAA are charged with the oversight of aviation gas, what role does the state have, if any, in changing these laws?
One way is if what Mr. Davies just said is accurate, we could change the alcohol formulation in gas in California. California has a very specific gasoline blend, different from other states. If in fact that blend is causing some pilots to not be able to use unleaded gasoline who otherwise were using it, that is something the state could address. We can also do resolutions to Congress urging them to fix this, as well as their FAA. We can hold hearings, we can provide evidence, we can raise this issue to the public.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Next witness, please.
Jim Lesner, Hermosa Beach. Oh, okay. I'd like to know how American lead levels in bone in particular compare with the lead levels, say, in Sweden and also in some other countries, maybe Africa or somewhere like that, where they have much less mechanization. A lady who was here at this meeting was talking to me about having visited Lithuania, which under Russian domination didn't even have much in the way of lead paint. I mean, they basically didn't come forward in technology as fast as we have. And I think it would be just very interesting and probably impressive to people here to see that, if it's the case, that other areas of the world have much lower lead levels in their bones. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll look into that issue. Next witness, please.
Hi, my name is Lisa Cody. I'm actually not a resident in your district, but I used to work for Congress. And
City, please.
Tahunga.
Okay, thank you.
I used to work for Congress, and I investigated the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And the one sort of resounding lesson I learned, or we learned, was that where there's a will, there's a way. So when that oil spill occurred, everyone said it's impossible to ever deal with a deep water blowout. The technology doesn't exist. Well, why doesn't the technology exist? Because no one ever had put money into actually looking how to deal with it. Instead, they'd put money into really doing a good job getting oil out of deep water, but having no technology to deal with the blowout. So what I would say to you is perhaps you should or could, or it would be a great idea to look further into really what are the technological barriers, if there really are the barriers, or is it just a lack of investment? What we found was that the regulatory agency in the federal government had less knowledge and less technological sort of savvy than the industry did when it came to oil spill technology, whether it was blowout preventers, whether it was the cap that they ended up developing. And it was only when the federal government said, we will not allow deep water drilling until you've developed this technology, that they finally got it. So, and even that technology is not perfect, but, and the federal government got a lot of grief for it, the MMS, the new agency. It used to be called the Minerals Management Service. But anyway, that bureau did not allow deep water drilling again until they developed this technology, and smack, 5 months, 6 months later, they had something they hadn't developed in 40 years. They had that technology. So.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. Thank you. Next witness, please.
Yeah, my name is Marco Leo. I live Westchester, right by LAX. I'm an elected member to the Republican Central Committee. I sat here and listened to most of the speakers, well, all the speakers, And if I were to give it a grade between A and F, I'd have to say I, incomplete. The first speaker spoke about health effects, and one of the things that caught me was he said that the only way to get rid of lead out of your body was, through medical, processes. But the Japanese have already figured it out that you can get lead out of your body with cilantro. That's, we should learn from them. They're even selling cilantro wontons now. Okay. A lot of the studies that we saw, I was taking, I was making mental notes of the years that the studies were done, and a lot of those studies were done before they even had low lead gasoline, the 100, low lead. Back then, they had 110 octane, which was the full amount of lead. So, those, I'd like to see what the studies would look like in today's environment. Also, another effect, I remember back in 1992 buying, 2 54-gallon drums of 110 high lead fuel for 90 cents a gallon. And now, speaking to the ALPA representative, now it's anywhere between $4 and $8 a gallon. And all you have to do is look in the sky and you see, how many prop planes are up there. I'd have to say on the weekends, the skies don't have as many airplanes as they used to on the weekdays back then. So there's a lot less operations going on. And one of my questions for, the Santa Monica and the Torrance Airport people was, what were your operations back then during those studies, and what are they now? Okay. And as far as lead in aviation fuel, I don't think that's that big of an issue. I think we have a bigger issue of lead in ceramic mugs. You get those for Christmas every year. You got a big collection of them. There's a lot of lead in those mugs. If solar flares were attacking us with gamma rays, hide it underneath the mugs. Basically, as far as all the, the research going on, I'm wondering, has anybody contacted NASA Ames Research Center on developing new fuels? The ALPA representative said no, that he's not aware of NASA Ames being involved. I do believe that there is a solution, but you got to get the right people in there. You can't just say, well, this is what we found, and then just go with something else and not do your thorough research. As to answer the Sweden fuel question, I've been an aircraft mechanic for 25 years. Sweden is in cold climate, and to operate down here in the warmer climate, your fuel detonation will happen in warmer climates. So the fuel in Sweden might not work here. Again, get NASA Ames involved. As though, to answer those people that want to close down Santa Monica Airport, we're sitting on sand dunes right here. In an earthquake of 7.0 or greater, LAX will be shut down. It will be shut down. The only solid rock we have is Santa Monica Airport in this entire basin. That place will still be here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, wait. One more.
Oh, go ahead.
One more. To answer the alcohol, fuel, a lot of top fuel dragsters, they run on alcohol. So, I'm a little bit aware of that. But I also know if you ever go down to Pomona and watch them race at Winter Nationals, the last fueling that they do is they put in regular fuel because of the oils involved. Alcohol has corrosion problems. They flew the Bell X-1, Chuck Yeager flew it Mach 1.0 and above, and he did it on hydrogen peroxide. Why can't we use it? It's highly corrosive. And these are different issues that we should consider before we just say, this is what we're gonna do. All right.
Thank you. Next witness, please.
Hi. First of all, I'm Robert Gurman, and my girlfriend and I came up from San Diego. We have the same problems down there that we are concerned with that you have up here. I want to thank you for having this because we have no opportunity down there as of yet to address this problem. I want to thank Mr. Rubin for notifying us, and I came up to your last one you had. One of the things that was mentioned was the flight patterns on the touch and goes, and I have a question for the pilots and the mechanics that are in here, is it true, and the engine builder, when they do touch and goes, they run full rich for a safety issue as far as the FAA? No, you don't run full rich on the engine?
Not necessarily, no.
It's not a standard operating procedure for LitComs or any of those engines?
No, your mixture is dependent upon atmospheric conditions,
Okay.
temperature, things of that nature.
Okay, well, that answered the one question. And then also the problem that we're having in San Diego is flight schools, which is addressed on the flight patterns. Continuously going around in circles would add to the lead content of the immediate airport. And so if we maybe found a solution to move flight schools to a more appropriate area, sort of like a zoning issue with apartments in your neighborhood, I think maybe we might have a temporary solution to the lead content in the immediate area of the airport. So again, I want to thank you for this.
Great. Thank you for coming up here. Hey, Al, go ahead.
Hello, Senator Liu. Thank you very much for putting this together, for gathering such a good group of experts from a variety of standpoints. I congratulate you on knowing who all to reach out to gather this group. I certainly learned a lot. I also wanted to thank you for your excellent environmental voting record this past year and leadership on environmental issues, aside from this. I had a couple of questions. Being a technical person, I sometimes have technical questions. I was wondering whether it's possible to inject some kind of octane boost additive just when needed for a power burst. You were mentioning that you need high octane for occasions when you really need that power burst, and obviously it'd be a retrofit. Huh?
Peterson Aviation website, alcohol injection.
Yeah, but anyway, so that would be that would be one way to run lower octane gas routinely, and then just and then just inject an octane additive when you need the extra boost of power. Would that really? I see you looking dubious.
You are correct. You just have to mix, maybe you have two tanks, and if they don't mix well, then it's going to be a problem. You cannot just, the gasoline engines mixing is very, you have to mix it very well. So just inject it when you need it may make big problems.
Okay. I mean, some analogy in a sense might be the requirement for low sulfur fuel for shipping around the around ports here in California. Other than that, perhaps some kind of scrubber on exhaust again to catch lead. I mean, one of the reasons that lead was removed from cars was to make it safe to run catalytic converters. Otherwise, you had lead plating on the catalytic converters, and they became useless after a short time. I also wondered about the economic impact of the IQ impact from leaded aviation gas. I asked Dr. Freunds, and he shook his head and shrugged. So that might be an additional statistical study to be worked on. And on the other side, then the cost to replace all engines requiring high octane avgas. So there you get into cost benefit analysis that would be interesting to look at.
No, thank you.
But anyway, thank you.
On that IQ point, I remember looking at those charts and thinking, all of us in this room are probably dumber than we should be. So,
when I remember the days when I was soldering lead,
Right.
for electronics kits.
Thank you. Next witness. Hi, John.
How you doing, Senator? We're dealing with an emotional issue. People's health and their safety is always going to generate a passionate response, and it should. It always should. To address it, though, it needs to be rooted in something other than the anecdotal. You're taking the steps to look at the science and to do the research. I implore you to continue along those lines. We've seen at the debate in Santa Monica, which, despite today's topic not really addressing Santa Monica Airport, you can see the passion that exists there. And yet, the vast majority of it isn't fact-based. Even some of the slides presented today and quote-unquote evidence presented today was not based in fact. It was anecdotal and suggestive and emotional. It's very dangerous, particularly in aviation. An aircraft is a complex machine. If it's treated incorrectly and not operated properly, there can be calamitous effects, and we've seen that. So these have to be, the steps taken here have to be carefully thought out. The government has already looked at eliminating lead from aviation fuel. I don't think you could find someone that would support keeping lead in fuel, except for safety matter, and if there's a viable alternative, and there should be the investment to find the viable alternative. But until there is one, rash decision-making, policy making cannot exist because there's too much at risk, including the very people's safety that are arguing for the elimination of lead.
Thank you. Can I ask you a couple questions?
Certainly.
For those pilots that want to fly unleaded in California, is there an issue with the California gasoline blend with that ethanol that prevents that from happening? Or what's your take on that?
I'm not an expert in the matter. What I do know is if a safe alternative was offered, everybody would use it. You may have pricing issues, and so if you had competing fuels, one was cheaper than the other and the leaded one was the cheaper one, you may have a marketplace issue. But I think that if you look at the voluntary actions of pilots, particularly in general aviation, to mitigate safety concerns and pollution concerns, their first instinct is to do what's right. Because, including myself, I live under the pattern at Santa Monica. I'm concerned as much as any of the residents here about the effects of aviation, particularly to those who live underneath the pattern. But that's not to say that I would do something that's unsafe or stupid for that matter. So if that's kind of an indirect answer to your question, but I do believe that if it was offered and it was appropriate for the use of aircraft, for the aircraft that's used at the airport, that people would invest in it.
Someone had raised the issue of, you have, for example, a Corvette that's running on unleaded. That seems pretty powerful. Just wondering, can we make that analysis that if we can have these really high-powered vehicle engines that run unleaded, why is that we couldn't have those same engines in propeller planes?
Again, I'm not qualified to speak to what a good fuel would be. But
Corvettes, they're not as reliable. When you're up in the air, you want reliability. And a Corvette engine is just not going to be as reliable up in the sky as it is on the ground. And if
I got it.
conks out,
I got it. All right.
Yeah.
No, thank you. Appreciate it.
That tends to be anecdotal. They are high-performance engines, and the regulatory bodies obviously are going to pay close attention to what's possible. If it was a simple solution of replacing the type of engine, I'm certain they would. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Sure. Next witness.
Good afternoon. I finally get to meet you. I've called your office numerous times. In fact, I've spoken to Jennifer. Now,
name and
I'm
city.
sorry. My name is Rose Colarusso. I live at 1520 8th Street, Manhattan Beach. I'm here with my neighbor. I was not informed that this was going to be specifically regarding the fuel, the lead problem. So I just want to present a few things upon walking my neighborhood, speaking to some of the residents. All of them have attested to my complaint about the excessive air traffic. And one of the ladies that I spoke to, I said to her, do you have a lot of soot in your backyard? She says, yes, my patio is covered.
This is Manhattan Beach?
Yes, sir.
And the air traffic from where?
Well, I called Torrance Airport. I called the Hawthorne Airport. I called LAX Airport. I called Long Beach Airport, who never called me back. I've spoken to two nice ladies at the FAA. In fact, they're doing an investigation right now because they've had a lot of complaints from some of the other residents in Manhattan Beach. But this goes a lot further than just Manhattan Beach. If I lived in Gardena or Torrance, Compton, I'd be doing the same thing. I think we've got a big problem, and it's going to take a long time to solve it. So with the one response I got from the one lady. She said she changed all her windows to soundproof windows, but then we talked about the soot. I have white French doors facing my backyard. Every couple weeks, I have to dust them off because there's a lot of fallout, on the doors. But I think that, we need to really think about more than this lead problem. We have too many planes flying overhead. One Saturday, I counted 14, and no offense to the pilots, 14 Cessnas in 1 hour. I just did my real estate renewal. I just passed it. I'm not active, but sitting at my desk that faces north and the window that faces west, I had it open because we don't have air conditioning. And let me tell you, vroom, vroom, that's all I heard were the jets leaving the airport. And another thing, too, disclosure and discrimination are the two biggest things in the real estate world. And I even called the local real estate office. I said, there's going to be a problem here with disclosure because if a real estate agent sells a house and there's a special disclosure form that I was advised to be very careful with if I was active in real estate, we're going to have a problem here because if a real estate agent doesn't disclose the excessive air traffic, there could be big problems. Plus, our property values are going to start going down, and this is a wide area. And let me tell you, we didn't work hard to lose everything we put into our house. So I think you need to do something about this, and I'm sick and tired of hearing all the planes all day long. We've got a lady on 6th Street, another lady whose 12-year-old child is fearful that a jet's going to crash on her roof. And my husband, he said to me, "Did you hear that plane last night?" I said, "No." 2:30 in the morning, we've got these big jets flying over our houses. The people are not happy, Senator. They are not happy. And I think I'm done.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let me, okay.
I wasn't going to say anything, but I have to. My name is Virginia Ernst, and I live 300 feet from the east end of Santa Monica Airport. My house was one of the homes that was in the EPA and the AQMD test sites. And they found elevated, I was the one that was 23, was it 0.23 with the lead content, and then it was found airborne lead and lead in the soil. And my question was for Dr. Freunds. I'd like to know how we can go about getting lead bone tests, because I had never heard of that before. And
I think he may have left, but if you
is there any way
talk to Jennifer,
that
we'll
out?
find out for you.
Because our community is really exposed. We're exposed directly to the aircraft. There's no barrier between the planes and our homes. And we felt that, some of us in our neighborhood felt that a lot of the lead that was propelled into our neighborhood was due to the jets that hold at the very end and take off. Right. And it was a buildup of lead at the end of the runway that was hurled at us. But I would be curious to find that out.
If you talk to Jennifer, we will look into that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Let me thank the Sergeant at Arms for being here. Let me thank the audiovisual personnel. Thank you. And to my wonderful staff that set this up, Jennifer, my district director. We have Lauren, Robert, David, Melissa, Veronica, Irving, Ray Sotero from my Capitol office, and then our Stanford intern who helped do this as well. Did I miss anybody? I think I got David. Thank you all for coming, and appreciate it. Thank you.